On behalf of Town Hall Seattle staff, Institute for Systems Biology, and our friends at Elliott Bay Book Company, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our presentation with Craig Mundie and Dr. Jim Heath discussing Mundie's book, Genesis. Co-author Craig Mundie is a leading technology executive and former chief research and strategy officer at Microsoft. Over his decades-long career, he has played a pivotal role in advancing artificial intelligence, computing, and national security initiatives. Mundie has also served as an advisor to the U.S. government on technology policy and is a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Dr. Jim Heath is the president for Institute of Systems Biology. Since 2018, he has led ISB, driving interdisciplinary research in cancer and immune system dynamics while advancing innovative approaches to complex diseases. Before ISB, he was the Elizabeth W. Gilloon Professor of Chemistry at Caltech and Professor of Molecular and Medical Pharmacology at UCLA. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Heath and Craig Mundie.
Thank you. Before we start, I want to acknowledge we've had a long partnership with Town Hall, and it's great to be back. And it's really terrific to see so many people that have come out to listen to what is an extremely topical area, I think. I'm really delighted to be able to share the stage this evening with my friend Craig Mundie. I've known Craig since around the time when I came to Seattle in 2018. Craig served on the ISB board until really just a couple months ago. I can tell you, you heard a little bit of his bio, but Craig is one of the most creative people and also one of the most challenging people that I've had the pleasure of getting to know. And so tonight, I think we will have a creative and challenging conversation about AI. And we're here, in fact, to talk about the book that came out, I think, just in the past half year, with Craig and Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger writing a book. And Craig tells me they wrote this book 2 years ago, which in the world of AI is, many generations. That's like your great-great-great-grandparents. But they wrote it in a way that it retains a timeliness. It wasn't about trying to anticipate the details of what the technology is going to do, and you can find that in other places. It was really about thinking about the social ramifications, the political ramifications, the defense ramifications, the scientific ramifications of the emerging revolution in AI and how that was going to impact our daily lives. And I ran through those 4 items, but that's basically daily life. It's almost everything. Let's start. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, I think to an outsider, this looks like we could all imagine you and Eric Schmidt writing a book together, but I think we're probably surprised to see Henry Kissinger on the title as well.
Yeah, Henry and I were friends, good personal friends, and did some work together for more than 25 years. So I first got to know Henry in 1998. I had been involved in working with the U.S. government on issues around encryption technology. And Henry was involved in many things, but among them, he was one of the founding members and a director of CSIS, which is a think tank in Washington. And at the end of working on the crypto questions, the person who I worked with at the Department of Defense, John Hamre, went to run CSIS, and he ended up inviting me to give a talk there, and I did, and Henry was sitting across the table from me. And so we hit it off and had lunch, and later went on to a very long-term personal friendship. So every other Friday for years and years, Henry and I would have a call and just talk about stuff. And about, 10 years ago, Henry and I were regular members of a meeting that happens once a year that talks about the North Atlantic situation geopolitically. It's called the Bilderberg meetings. And about 10 years ago, Eric was invited to those meetings, and he developed similarly a friendship with Henry. And when Henry was 95, which was now about not quite 7 years ago, Eric and I had arranged to have a broad briefing about artificial intelligence and our views of how it was going to evolve, presented to this meeting, and Henry was there. And he listened to it, and he was immediately struck by the importance of the idea that we would have birthed machines that were smarter than people. And Henry's training was in history and philosophy, and of course he had tremendous experience in diplomacy and strategy. And he immediately started to think about this. And in the end, he made the decision to devote whatever remained, which turned out to be 5 years of his life, till just around age 100 and a half when he died. He devoted the last 5 years to this question of how could he help inform the thinking about the implications of a superintelligence arriving on planet Earth and what its effects would be. After kind of learning a lot through discussions with us and other people that were arranged, Henry embarked with Eric and Dan Huttenlocher from MIT, and they wrote a book before this one, about 2 years before it, that was, I call it, before ChatGPT. So there's a lot less general familiarity with the topic, but their book tended to focus more on what the downside risks were, because as AI was being discussed and emerging, you had a lot of notable people, including Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, and others, and Elon Musk, in fact, who expressed concern about its effects. And so they wrote a book, and it talked a lot about, the potential downside risks, but also some of the benefits. But at the end, in conversations that I had with Henry, we both believed, and I had spent a lot of time thinking about how could humans ultimately try to ensure that there was a long-term symbiotic relationship between humans and the machines. And that sort of buoyed us up to the point where Henry said to me one day, well, we should write a book now, and we should focus more on helping people understand the upside and why we can be optimistic about it, because we can at least see a path. And that led to this book, which Eric then joined us on. And we worked on it for about a year, which was Henry's last year, and it was published last November.
And you also, with Henry, had some relationship between the U.S. and China on trying to understand if there was ways that we could have conversations to responsibly develop the technology, I suppose?
Yeah, Henry, of course, was famous for and even revered in China broadly because people associated the reopening of China to the rest of the world as really having come through his own efforts, and not only the diplomacy in the Nixon period itself, but ultimately creating the Shanghai Communique in 1971 or 2, I forget, which ended up giving a stable foundation to the relationship, geopolitical relationship between the U.S. and China and Taiwan, which even back then, 50 years ago, was a sensitive question. And Henry, was a counselor in his late years to many heads of state, and President Xi was no exception. And so when Henry was 100, there was a discussion initiated by President Xi where he was looking for some counsel from Kissinger. By that time, this was 5 years into Henry's sort of 5-year focus on AI. Kissinger said he was concerned his health was poor. President Xi wanted him to go to China, and he said, I'll take that risk, but only if we also spend time talking about artificial intelligence. Because he says, I think this is really the problem for the ages. And President Xi agreed to that, and they went and had those set of discussions. One outcome of that was that they agreed to sponsor what's called a Track 2 dialogue, which is an informal bilateral discussion on the topic of AI. And originally Henry was going to chair that. I was going to be the co-chair on the U.S. side. And when Henry died, just before he died, he implored me to make sure that the book got published and the Track 2 dialogue continued, and indeed it has. And so we're still having those discussions to maintain, an ongoing channel among people in the two countries, each of whom recognizes that we operate in an increasingly tense geopolitical environment, but that this thing is coming one way or another, and the effects will be very profound, and so we want to be as prepared as we can be to look for opportunities when they arise to try to normalize how the countries operate with each other as it relates to the issues of controlling AI more than developing it. Lots of people will continue to develop it, but the issue isn't development so much anymore. It's basically trying to figure out how you get a handle on controlling it such that as it develops superintelligence and gains its own agency, that there's a long-term, positive relationship between the machines and people.
So before we get, and I think that's actually probably going to constitute the heart of what we talk about, but before we get into that, if you've been in Seattle with companies like Amazon and Microsoft and the technology around us, you've probably been aware that things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, neural nets, these kind of algorithms, which actually some of the original ones came out of Caltech, where I was, with John Hopfield, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in this area just a year ago. Those were all sort of evolving at some pace. But in 2022, there was a sea change with the release of ChatGPT. And maybe give us some background on, why was that a sea change? Why did that suddenly mark the before and after in this field?
Well, I think there were two aspects. One aspect was sort of a maturation in terms of technological capability, and the other aspect was bringing it forward into the marketplace in a form that actually allowed it to be taken up, in fact, by individuals, even before it was taken up by companies. And in that regard, its launch was more like a consumer product than a technical product or a product for companies to use. And I think it was the combination of those things that produced this incredibly rapid adoption, and therefore it just became part of the popular discussion at a very high rate. The technological progress, as you said, starts way back in the 60s even. I think even the first discussions about AI and the term itself, other than in science fiction sense, goes back to the 50s. But like many other things that have been investigated, academically for decades, something finally comes along that catalyzes a change. And in the case of artificial intelligence, in my mind, there's really two phases. There's a phase you might call machine learning, and it was a precursor to what we see now, which is the emergence of more intelligent machines. And the difference is machine learning tended to be trying to train a machine narrowly to be able to repeat some function or make some forecast. And you took a huge amount of data that were exemplars of what you wanted the machine to do, and you showed it to the machine, and you tried to create a network that would emulate that behavior. And in that environment, the analogy for me is it's like saying you have a newborn baby, and they're just laying there on their back in the crib. You say, "Hey, great, you've got a brain that is formative now, and I'm going to make it do one thing really well. And I don't care about anything else. I'm just going to show you pictures or whatever it is and try to teach you how to do one thing." it can't build on any other learnings that might happen to that same kid if it grew up first, and then you started trying to teach it. And so a lot of what people called artificial intelligence, I'll say from the 70s through maybe 10 years ago, was really more like this machine learning phenomena. It wasn't on a path where it was achieving something that looked like it was intelligence. It was just getting really good at emulating certain things that humans, could do or cause to be done, and we could teach the machine to recognize them or repeat them. And then some of these technologies, called transformer models and other things started to emerge as a different way to code up these neural networks. But the two big changes that came was courtesy of the internet and the emergence of cloud computing. We had two things that we didn't have in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. We had a boatload of data that was all digitally accessible, and we had a lot more computing. So it turned out some of the ideas, all the way back to Hopfield and others, weren't really that broken. It's just that we didn't have enough computing and enough data to basically make them get smart enough to do anything. So all that dead zone, or the valley of death as it's often called in the AI field, was just, in a sense, nobody really understood it, but it was not that the ideas were flawed, but that the infrastructure to make them perform had not yet emerged. So ML got a big boost at that point. People were deploying it a lot. And then this movement, toward, or let's say a goal of actually creating intelligent machines started to be articulated. One of the first places that happened really seriously was at DeepMind, first as an independent company in London. And Google, who had a lot of investment in these related areas, thought that was an interesting group of people, and they acquired them. And that sort of began a more formal attempt to actually say our goal is generally intelligent machines, not just a system that in a particular narrow field could be trained to do something that looked like it was useful. And so that began this quest for how do you now scale up these networks to get them to be really intelligent. As that became, I'll say, sexier, many people relabeled ML as AI because they weren't changing what they were doing, but if you wanted to talk to a venture capitalist or somebody else, if you said, hey, I'm doing machine learning, they would yawn and say, that's so yesterday, I want to do AI. But if you relabeled your ML as AI, then you look like the hot thing today. And so, but that unfortunately created a lot of confusion between were you really training narrow models or were you trying to create a genuine intelligence. So as DeepMind evolved and then as companies like OpenAI got formed, they stuck a G in there, AGI, to basically try to distinguish, from what was an evolved ML environment and the quest for real intelligence. And the idea of real intelligence is that it, the simple definitions early on were it had to be as good as a human in a bunch of domains. Therefore, it had to be more generalized. It couldn't just be a specialist. And so the term AGI emerged that way. And that's kind of how we got there. And the final step was ultimately a realization that even the machines, being as big as they weren't big enough to train these machines to be generally intelligent. And that discovery really came at the hands of OpenAI more than anybody else back about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, so I think of, I was going to get to this a little later, but I think of Gen AI as generative, meaning it actually generates new information, new insights, new ways to look at the world that you wouldn't get without that, which is really a quantitative change from just processing through data, which is sort of where we were a few years back.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think the real big difference is it's not algorithmic, all right? I mean, everything we've done with computers sort of up to this point, a human would want the machine to do something. It might be capable of doing it at rates that humans could never attain, but we wrote a program that explicitly said, go do this. In this world, this is an oversimplification, there's only one program, and the program is
right.
learn, right?
Right.
And so all these things that these machines do now, they're doing by and large because they learn how to do it as opposed to are programmed to do it. And that's the qualitative change that shifts us out of what you might think of as the information age into the intelligence age. It's the thing that basically says, hey, we got a lot of information, we can make a lot of computers, we can write a program, but you can't make leaps beyond what the programmer imagined when they wrote the code to do the thing. And so here, we're essentially building a brain that, by some measurements, doesn't have as many little processing elements like neurons and connections as a human does, but the ones it has are wildly faster,
Right.
and sort of makes up in speed what it loses in parallelism or other things. But as the machines have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, we're roughly approximating, the amount of neuronal capacity that a human brain has, but we can train it a lot faster. In fact, it was just about, I think it's about 2 years ago now, that the time to train from scratch a machine brain to roughly the level of intelligence of an adolescent human, which you might think of as a fairly well-developed brain, crossed over. So an adolescent takes 15 years to get to that point, and we had enough computing power 3 or 4 years ago that if you sat the thing down and had enough data, and you let it run for 15 years, it'd match the teenager. But we've made the machines bigger and bigger and faster for the last few years too, and now the time for it to match the teenager is actually only a couple of weeks.
Right.
And so that's where these real changes are coming from, that we can start from nothing and not just train a human, a teenager, for example, who might, or even someone that is in college, they're still very narrowly trained. I did some electrical engineering and computing, you did a lot of stuff in biology and medicine, but, we don't have an equal understanding of each other's disciplines because we didn't have time, to learn that much stuff. So I think the real gift of these machines going forward is, in fact, their ability to ingest in a single brain all the stuff that humans collectively ingest and learn about in all of the brains. But for us, it's distributed, and in the machine, it isn't. And its ability to reason across all these domains simultaneously is something humans will never be able to do. And that's why these things will become so powerful and valuable and will allow, with humans involved, at least at this point, in doing things that we can't do ourselves.
Well, I think that's the part that humans are involved at this point is probably somewhat transient. I think one expects that right now we do have the capacity to manage the development of these machines, but as we come up with different ways to unhobble them, as we come up with machines that are looking after machines, and by the time I have a granddaughter, I think by the time that was born last year, I think by the time she enters kindergarten, we're not going to be in charge of these machines anymore. Or if we are, it's going to look very different. And I wonder how you're thinking about that. You're very strategic in terms of thinking about issues like this.
This question is one that I've devoted a lot of my own personal time to for the last 4 or 5 years. Because to me, the die is cast. We're on the path. We're building this capability. The machines aren't even yet helping us to make themselves faster. That'll come at some point down the road. And so the real question becomes not how do you control them in some regulatory sense. It's how do you imbue them with some value set such that as they evolve toward whatever they're going to become, that they share something, in common with what defines humanity, and that we kind of evolve together. In the book, we actually say you should think about this as going through 3 stages. The first stage we're in today, and we call this the tool phase. Essentially everything humans have ever invented, back from fire and the wheel and flint tools and other stuff, they were all tools. And they either gave us more mechanical capacity or more intellectual capacity, but they were always just tools to help us do more. This technology is the most important and profound thing humans have ever done. And as it now achieves this independent intelligence, it will now not stop at just being a tool. So stage 2 in the book, we call this coexistence. And this is sort of when it attains a level and humans come to grips with the fact that what we've actually done is we've birthed another species. It just isn't biological. And so now we are cohabiting this planet. We already cohabit the planet with a bunch of other intelligent species. It's just we've been on top. And now what's happening is we're essentially birthing a new one. It just isn't biological. But if you look at all the other sort of definitions of speciation, this thing will exhibit them more and more. So now you face down this question that says, all right, during this period of time, what do we do? What is the relationship between the machine and its intelligence and humans? So in somewhat lighthearted way, I tell, we as humans, we need to get our act together and decide, well, what do we want to be when we grow up? Because this thing is going to keep going and surpass us in some dimensions. If we want to add value and figure out what our relationship should be in a sustaining way, we have to say, how do we get better too? Because it's going to continue to be on a path to get better. To me, the great opportunity here is that many of the things that have limited humans getting better, Jim and I spent many years now on healthcare, and what we know really is we'd really rather you didn't get sick, but we don't know enough about our own biology to figure out how to keep you from getting sick. But my own belief is that while biology is too complicated for humans, our own biology, it's not too complicated for these machines. And so for the first time, these machines can actually help us understand ourselves to the point that we can start to make changes to humans that would essentially improve our lot in life, but we may choose to endow ourselves with different capabilities. About this time, we may decide, hey, we're going to become spacefaring. We're going to send some part of our population, off in a very Star Trekian way. And right now, our physiology is not optimal for, this. It's optimal for here, but it isn't optimal for space or Mars or whatever it is. We might decide, wow, we should tune up some humans, so that they're better for these tasks. I don't know how that'll all play out, but I know that without the machines, we're not going to be able to do it, but with the machines, we probably could. So during this coexistence period, humans have got to figure out, wow, this is our shot. We get to figure out how do we evolve, in a better way. And that leads you to the third phase. And the third phase we call coevolution. So now what's happened is the machines have developed enough independence and agency that they're basically driving themselves forward, just as we have as a species, from the cave. And but humans now have been empowered in this partnership with the machines to basically also drive ourselves forward. And what we choose to do with that, I think, is one of the great questions that lies ahead. And these questions are not simply technical or biological; they're philosophical, and have many, many other, deep implications. And one of the things Kissinger always pointed out when I first met him was that all this computing stuff he thought was the most important triggering technological evolution since the printing press. And while we've been in a lot of other stuff, he said, yeah, but the printing press, changed the world from, one where information was very narrowly controlled and accessible to one where it became very broadly controlled. And he said it took 300 years, but ultimately the entire European society was completely transformed, from largely kingdoms and fiefdoms, to the emergence of the nation states we know today. And the whole society changed. You got the Enlightenment, which was sort of this, and the Renaissance, the collaboration between, the emerging scientist community, the philosophers, the artists, the world we all live in, we kind of lose sight of it. It's only a few hundred years old. The countries, by and large, that we think about today, they've only been around since the Treaty of Westphalia, which was essentially, some 100 plus years after the printing press, a couple hundred years. And so when Henry was in his late years and he learned about this AI thing, he said, wow, this is even bigger than computing. It's sort of the next big thing. And he said, his view and his concern was that this would be the next greatest, perhaps the greatest ever triggering invention. And the downstream effects of this, over the next few hundred years, would be hard to anticipate, but it's unlikely to leave us collectively in the societal structures that we currently have. And so the book, in part, is trying to urge people to recognize that we have a finite window as a species globally to figure out what are we going to do, how are we going to add value, what's our long-term operational relationship relative to these other things. And there aren't that many possible outcomes, but humanity will have a chance. Why do I say that? If you've watched all the movies like Independence Day or many that go back decades in science fiction, the spaceship shows up one night overhead. The humans all look up and say, uh-oh, they got here, we didn't get there. We don't know anything about them. And the good news here is we're building this thing. And, we can see its emerging capabilities, but at the same time, we can try to have this thing grow up in a way where, it wants to maintain a symbiotic relationship with humans and figure out, in a co-evolved environment, where does it all end up? And that's an opportunity we have, but the window to try to intervene to make that happen that way is finite. And in fact, it's relatively short compared to what, people often think about. So part of the goal of the book was to get people to start thinking at these bigger issues and not get too focused on only the narrow applications.
Yeah, it's probably just a handful of years. Yeah. So there's a concept, I want to actually get to science in a minute, but there's a concept you bring up in this book I thought was an interesting way to think about this. I don't know if I remember the word exactly. It's from a French sociologist.
The doxa.
The doxa, exactly, which is a way of looking at, I guess, common mores that you see across societies. It's the kind of thing where you know it when you see it, but actually hard to pin down exactly what it means. But to instill, I guess, a doxa, a set of fundamental ethical values into AI, which we have a few years. This is the time to do it.
Yeah, the doxa was sort of a moment of epiphany for me, while I was pondering this question of how could you control AI? And the short answer that Dario Amodei, who went on to found Anthropic, and I came up with about 6 years ago, was we couldn't, in the end, think of any way to do it other than with an AI. So kind of fight fire with fire. And so then that leads you to some challenging engineering and other questions about, well, okay, how do you make the governing or the adjudicating AI work? And it wasn't that hard to think about how to train it on certain classes of rules, like, oh, we've all got laws, let's teach it about law. That's necessary but not sufficient. And the reason that we worried that you couldn't just do this by human monitoring or involvement goes back to my earlier comment about the polymathic nature of these machines. Their great gift is going to be to do the things that the humans will never expect or can't figure out by themselves. And if you think any of those are potentially bad, then you need to prevent them. And since humans can't predict them, they can't write a rule in advance to stop them. And so that left me with this dilemma of thinking, all right, well then how do you get the machine to be able to do what we think humans do, which is to have these fundamental moral and ethical groundings that said, when all else fails, I'm going to make a good decision. And the question is, how do you do that? So I was talking to a woman who was working with me to think through these things, and it turned out she was a programmer, but her background, formal training, was in cultural anthropology. And I said, I've read that, there have been studies done that show that in all human societies, everywhere on the planet, if you study them kind of at the level of young people or at a more primordial sense, that there seem to be some common moral and ethical attributes that they all share. It didn't matter, where they were, they all had this thing. And the cultural anthropologist and the sociologist have studied this to a significant degree. And they concluded, yep, it's all there. It's not innate. You're not born with it. You learn it early on in some sort of folkloric way. And they named it the doxa. And it turned out that was a perfect jigsaw puzzle piece for this puzzle, because I needed something that humans didn't think that they disagreed on, right, which would ground the machine at the end of the day. And so the challenge, which we have some ideas about, is if babies learn the doxa, how can the machine learn the doxa? And there's some ways we think we know how to do that. But what that means is that you can build a system that monitors or controls the AI, or maybe can be integral to the AI, that at the end of the day says, if I see I'm about to do something, or some person is asking me to do something, which never has been done before, but I think it might be bad for humans, can I make a decision to proceed or not proceed by looking at the doxa? And our belief is that, yes, you can do that. And so it's that kind of work, which is really orthogonal to how the AIs themselves are being developed. It's how do you do more than just train them on everything that's on the internet, good, bad, and indifferent. It's how do you give them some training or some mechanism by which their choices, as time goes on, are actually governed not merely by the express rules that humans have written or that nature has given us, like the laws of physics and chemistry, but by things that really probably are the defining, underpinning, moral and ethical basis of humanity.
That's somewhat reassuring that you think this is a soluble problem. So let me...
We're trying hard.
Yeah, okay. So I want to conclude with some discussion on science and biomedicine, then we'll open it up to questions. And let me just give some stories from my own lab, and then, which I think are interesting in this context. So over the past year, in many ways spurred on by the fact that Craig told us we were idiots if we didn't do this kind of thing,
That's why I was difficult.
Yeah, exactly. That's the challenging part. We've taken parts of biology that were associated with immunology. I'm actually trained as a physical scientist, but we do immunology in my lab. Now, areas of immunology that until just 2 years ago or so were highly underdetermined, and it didn't really matter what algorithm you had. If you don't actually have anything to learn, it's not gonna be valuable. But over the past couple of years, there's been enough information out. And recently working with Scott Boyd, just using these little molecular pieces, but very comprehensive views of immunology, of your adaptive immune system, we have a science paper coming out on doing diagnostics for, I don't know, half a dozen diseases. And it actually works with like 99% accuracy, staggering level of accuracy that you would never expect to see in the clinic. And then more recently, we've been developing these agents that are generative. And some of us, like when we get a certain disease, all of us will react differently. But occasionally you'll see certain cells that will emerge that are actually super fighters against the disease. And we share them. And it doesn't happen very often, and it turns out if you leave those super cells out of this calculation, it will generate them for you. Absolutely amazing. And on top of that, you can begin extracting rule sets of the immune system, and you can actually look and see, as people get old, their immune system begins to quit following these rule sets. But it doesn't happen to everybody. But the people that it does happen to, it turns out is men, and it's a certain small fraction of men, they don't do well when faced with certain challenges, okay? So all of this is telling us that we have new ways to look at medicine, new ways to look at human health, the diversity of human health. It's widely accurate, it's very predictive, and it's using information that is as far away from a doctor's office as you can imagine. And at the same time, if you look at, we're on Pill Hill right here, close to it. The medical system has been able to withstand the last 5 or 6 generations of information technology advances. So there's a huge pressure there, and I wonder how you see that. You've been strategically thinking about biomedicine and AI for a long time. How do you see that playing out?
I think one of the things we talked about earlier tonight was that the AI is creating an alternative way to deal with the capabilities of these computing systems. You can sit there and just have a conversation now with the newest chat GPT or like system. And so many things didn't get done because people thought it was too expensive or too slow or too complicated to program them to be done. Many people in the healthcare environment thought, the big thing was the electronic medical record, in essence, just, digitizing the thing that used to be, painstakingly kept in file folders, in giant storage rooms. And that was valuable, but it wasn't changing the way medicine was done. It was only changing the way we tended to, keep records about it and bill for it and things like that. So technology was much more of an efficiency mechanism for the business of medicine than it was thought to be a fundamental driver of a new way to do it. This is very obvious in the medical case, but to varying degrees, that's the same issue that you have in a lot of science. But science, which is a precursor to medical care,
right,
has been much more necessarily using computer technology to advance. I can't think now of a field of science or even social sciences where people make substantial progress without using a computer.
I mean, you can't.
Right. And so, it's qualitatively changed how science gets done. Medicine is lagging that. Now along comes the AI, and the way science is going to get done is going to be qualitatively changed again, to where the AI is going to be a partner in defining the strategy for doing the science. It's not just an information tool, to be used as part of the strategy developed by the scientist. And so there's this, I think, big change coming. And Dario Amodei, in a paper he wrote last October, he left OpenAI and went on to found Anthropic. And he, in this paper, pointed out that it was his belief that as AGI arrived, which he, and I tend to agree, thinks is probably in roughly the 3-year to 5-year time horizon, maybe probably on the shorter time, that you would get a step function change on the order of perhaps 10 or 20x in terms of the rate at which you can do scientific discovery and engineering. And it's hard for people to imagine, what a 10 or 20x thing is like. But he said one way to think about this is look at all the capabilities humans have today, all our progress in science and engineering and computing and everything else, and you look at all the things we do, build buildings, bridges, rockets, et cetera, electronics. He said, okay, if you take that and you forecast from here to the end of the century, you think, well, wow, what could we do by, 2100 and beyond? And you say, wow, that could be pretty good. But if it turns out that you're right and these things now get a 20x accelerator, then everything humans would have done this century will be done by 2035. That's a huge opportunity, right? But it's hard to imagine things that were truly in the realm of science fiction may in the next few years become not just science fact, but something that we'll be able to put into production in the span of the next 4 or 5 years. So by the time your granddaughter, basically gets into early school years, she's going to be living in a world that used to think was just science fiction. And the question is, what's the rate of diffusion? But the rate of discovery is going to be dramatic. And that'll be true in the biological, and health sciences too.
Yeah, well, I think we'll probably turn to questions in just a minute, but I could see when ChatGPT first came out, I mean, you pointed out to the board that at a board meeting, this was a sea change. And it wasn't maybe 8 months later when you looked and it was ChatGPT 4 or some more advanced person. And you began to appreciate that this was actually the tool that would be telling you what your next experiment should be. Right. And, we've been incorporating that kind of thing into experiments for a long time. But now it simply sees things that you don't see. And they're robust. It's just that you can only make so many patterns in your own mind, but these bots can hold a 1,000-dimensional structure in their mind, which is actually remarkable.
Yeah, the high-dimensional reasoning is the great capability for which humans just don't have the physiological basis to do it, and we don't have time.
We don't have time, and also, and this is something that Lee talked about before, as you know, my predecessor at ISB, is that we tend to think, as humans, we tend to think linearly. So if you think about where we are today, you think we're going to be twice as far in a certain amount of time. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is geometric changes on a time scale that is like a quarterly time scale. And so I think your book, which, most of the AI books, if you take one a year ago, that came out a year ago and you read it, it's like outdated. But one that really looks at, as you did, looks at the ethical and moral considerations and how you think about how we're going to interface with this I mean, at some point, we are going to be the species, as you point out in your book. And, you know, when is that red line? Maybe it's in 2030. I don't know. But it's the kind of thing that we need.
The reason
to be
people
thinking about
legitimately
deeply.
worry about some of these things is if you say, okay, you know, if you look at just on Earth, you know, humans being at the top of the pyramid, how well have we treated all the less intelligent things?
Yeah, not so well.
Yeah, and so the question is, all right, well, you know, if this thing says, what's their value add? You know, that's a problem, and at least for us.
Yeah. Okay, I think we will open it up to questions. So I think the lights are going to come up. We have microphones here, and so I would ask people to come up if you for some reason you can't get out because you're ambulatory issue or you're in the middle of the row and you don't want to bother people. Shout it out. I will try to repeat the question.
You can also scan the QR code, and that question will come right to this iPad, and I will ask it for you. But we're happy to open it up to questions now.
Yeah, we're going to go for raised hands mostly because I can't look at. You have a question already.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I have, actually, I'm trying to put three things together. First of all, have you ever heard of the book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein?
I've heard of it, but I didn't read it.
Okay. It is one of the first references I've ever read of AI. So it leaves me with two questions. One is AI and imagination. Do we see this as all these things that it's discovering that we don't see? Are we calling that imagination? And the second question is, can we be friends?
As to the imagination question, you know, it's kind of similar to another question people ask quite frequently, which is it conscious? You know, and you know, there's lots of different people with different definitions of what consciousness means. Whether this is imagination or not, you know, my sort of non-technical definition of imagination is the ability to do synthesis on something, you know, and produce a new idea that was not obvious.
See beyond the world we're currently seeing.
Yeah, and by that definition, I think these things absolutely have imagination, and you know, it may gain these capabilities to imagine solutions simply because it can combine more things than a human can. So when Jim says, well, you know, apply it to some of these biology things, was it imagination that it figured out, you know, how this system worked, or not? And I mean, you know, for humans, there's this sort of blurry line between intuition, imagination, you know, and I personally don't think that there's any particular mode of how humans operate at a sort of brain level that these things can't ultimately duplicate. And we may have to make them more powerful, but we may also have to socialize them in a different way. Today, they only experience the world through artifacts that humans have created to try to give them some sense of the world, like photographs or movies. But they're not out there like a person is physically encountering and dealing with the world. That will come. Certainly the intersection between a lot of forms of robotics and sensing and these things will start to give it that capability too. But you know, short answer is yes. As to whether we can be friends or not, you know, it kind of comes back to these two things. One, while we're making it, you know, do we find a way to give it some enduring, you know, values that allow some aligned, you know, interest in the long term? And two, you know, what do we as humans, you know, do during this parallel time period, even with the help of the machine, you know, to give ourselves more interesting capabilities? I mean, you know, I think a lot of whether you can be friends or not is in part, you know, a measure of how big the gap is intellectually between, creature A and creature B. And, if you can see some, something on which to be friendly, then you can go. But if the gap gets too big, I think it gets harder and harder to find these points of resonance. And it's why, certain animals on the planet humans get friendly with, and others they don't. And that's part behavioral and part, I think, how much the intellectual symbiosis can be found.
Got it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So one of my questions is, once AI is more intelligent than us and more intelligent of us as a whole of humanity, won't it write its own rules at that point, whether or not, like you mentioned that we can train it earlier on, but once it becomes so intelligent, more intelligent than us, won't that training not really matter in the long run? And then the next one was, I don't think it's fair to compare our situation to when you mentioned that, where do you see something of greater intelligence really, like, ants and dogs, and us treating them fairly, because none of those other species have given birth to us. Do you think there will be any loyalty from AI, being that humanity is the proud parents?
Don't know.
Have you met teenagers? Do they?
Yeah. It's hard to tell. My own personal philosophy at this point is to work hard at trying to basically use the fact that we are engineering these things, and use the fact that we're doing that to try to make there be something intrinsic that puts your finger on the scale of that question. Can you increase the probability that you can have friendship, or that you see some long-term value in this symbiotic thing? And the thing I didn't go into, but if you really extrapolate far out in this thing, in this coevolutionary period, you could say, all right, during the coexistence phase, humans set their path, and the machine increasingly sets its path. And you enter this co-evolving environment. At that point, at some level of abstraction, you could say there's only three possible outcomes in terms of the relationship. The first outcome is, that the thing becomes so superior, it doesn't see any utility in humans. It may not be anti-human, it just may not think that there's a lot of value in this relationship. The second possible outcome is that humans are evolving in a way relative to the machines that, it's kind of like two civilizations that decide they want to have a happy coexistence. And so there's some symbiosis there. And the third possible outcome is hybridization. And, that's where you decide, wow, these machines have some value, these humans have some value, but 1 + 1 would be 3. And, at that point, we may have the engineering capability to decide that the biological species and the silicon species essentially come together in some way. And, that's very, science fiction-like, but I personally don't see an impediment to that being achievable from the point of view of engineering and biology. And so how we use our agency in this intermediate time, to say, what is the future of the human species? What do we do? How do we add value in this evolving environment? That'll somehow sway which one of these three things ends up being the most likely outcome. But I don't think, beyond that level of description, I don't think it's possible to guess, exactly where things will end up.
So while you were talking, I thought of two things. They've sort of been mentioned, but I want to ask them directly. The first one is we have an intelligence that's somewhere at primary school level. We're not talking about intellectual capability. We're talking about ability to make decisions in a way that are workable for the environment. That's different, okay? What are you going to do when it starts going through adolescence? Because it should be really interesting when it starts saying no in its own way, which can be done by no or rebellion or giving you answers that will not really solve your problem, but make it happy. And the other thing is that no one's mentioned Asimov's 3 rules for robots, which is like, the first one is like, the robot will not harm human beings, okay? Second one is something like, and it's been years since I've read that, is like, the robot will not harm itself unless it has to, so it doesn't break rule 1. And then the third rule is the robot will not harm anything else unless it has to for rules 1 and 2. And yet there's no mention about building that intelligence, and of course, that's a useful intelligence before it gets to adolescence, is all I can say.
It's all in how you squint at these things. I mean, the discussion we had about the doxa is roughly a more primal way of what I think Asimov was trying to get with these 3 rules. It turns out that these machines, they already exhibit the properties that you described as adolescence. All right, so that's not a yet to come. That's already demonstrated. In certain environments where people are testing these machines, you can see today that they are willing to lie and cheat in order to achieve an objective if the humans essentially direct them to do so. And that's why the way you govern these things has to essentially allow for many forms of bad acting. There can be bad acting at the initiation of the machine itself. There can be a very well-intentioned machine that's directed by humans to do something that's bad for other humans. And frankly, I worry a lot more myself about the short-term use of good machines by bad people to do bad stuff than I do that the machine is going to rise up and basically decide to undertake a lot of these bad things on its own. And so a lot of this is sort of a moment in time, and it really boils down to the question of architecture. Can you basically design these things in a way where as all these things are taking place, you have some discrete way of dealing with each class of these problems. And, all these are good questions, but there's no simple answers. And, even if I said, hey, I could take those 3 rules and stick them in there, I can fairly quickly give you all kinds of things that don't violate those 3 rules, but you probably wouldn't want the machine to do. All right? And, pardon me?
Depending on who you are.
Well, sure, but when Asimov did that, he wasn't worried about the who you are. He was just trying to make sure the robot did the right thing. And so, here you've got, this is the ultimate dual-use technology. And what that means is that, everything it does, taken to an extreme, can have either great benefit or potentially great downside risks. And, these are just the reality of what happens when you invent something as potent as this.
And what about the adolescents?
Well, I already answered that. It's already behaving in adolescent terms. It will tell you no. It will lie to you. So yeah, we're already dealing with that.
Okay, so I was told by town hall that if we go past 8:45, we're not welcome back. So I think we have time for one more question and a relatively brief answer. So, and just let me say a few words before you answer. So, there is a table over there, and Craig may not have agreed
We're gonna take
to
at
do
least
this,
two,
but
'cause
he
old
will
Bob
agree to go over there and sign a book if you want to buy one.
We're going to take at least two questions because Bob Mugley, who's my long-term friend, is there, and I want to hear what he has to ask.
We're going to take, even if we're not welcome back, we'll take 2 questions. Okay.
So something you mentioned earlier is that AI is able to learn something an adolescent might take 15 years to learn within like 2 weeks. And so I am a rising senior in college at Hopkins. And as someone going into the job market, thinking about how AI is able to easily replicate the skills of an entry-level candidate, what kinds of skills and experiences do you think are important for someone like me to get before entering the job market in the next couple of years?
That question comes up at almost every one of these sessions. Most of the time, it's the parents of the kids that are in school that ask the question. But my answer is that the premium going forward is going to be on adaptability. Sometimes I answer this by saying what you really like to have is a liberal STEM education. All right? In other words, people study the liberal arts and they say, its value is that it just teaches you how to think, and then people study STEM, science, technology, engineering, et cetera, math, and you become very focused on some specific discipline. And what I think is going to be very important is to be very grounded in these technical disciplines at a baseline level, but that you have to spend a lot more time thinking how do you adapt and how do you adapt quickly. And that's a little different because we've historically told people that the path to excellence is to become a really deep expert in a really narrow field. And a lot of our education is targeted at moving you in that direction. But as this world changes very quickly, those who can adapt and have the flexibility themselves to use these capabilities and to work on new problems, I think will find themselves better equipped than those who went deep early in their education.
I agree with that, and I'll just say, we had a faculty retreat today, and one of the messages that I gave the faculty is on the subject we're talking about, if you are not uncomfortable, you're in the wrong place. You have to be uncomfortable. And that is the nature of, I think, the world that we're entering into.
Okay, Bob, last question.
That was a good question. You mentioned consciousness, and there's a lot of different theories of consciousness. What's your sort of view on that, and do you think that is a requirement in order for AGI and then ultimately superintelligence?
I'll answer it backwards. No, for the last part. I mean, I don't think these machines, by almost any definition, I would say today are conscious, but I already believe that they are super intelligent relative to humans. And so, consciousness, may be some other state that emerges at some point in time, but I don't think it's a prerequisite for them to exceed human capabilities in a wide array of technical fields or any field, frankly.
But in your view, what is your view of our consciousness and how that came about?
I kind of feel like I'm the wrong guy to answer that question. I kind of think of human consciousness as what has evolved over a very long time, through struggle and shared experiences, and that that somehow creates the condition where you have consciousness. You're aware of yourself in an environment, and you're aware of what's around you. And it may be that the thing that the machine lacks, I mean, this is wild speculation on my part, but today the machine doesn't get to wander around in the real world. It isn't experiencing it other than proxied through actually through digital bits that represent the output of sensors that humans created in order to come up with a digital representation for convenience purposes of the world that we operate in. And I do believe that the AIs will ultimately gain this capability to do that directly, to both, operate in and make changes to the real world. And somehow for me, at more of an instinctive level, it seems like when you get enough of them doing that, then some form of consciousness, might emerge for them too. But I'm not a social scientist or a psychologist or a philosopher or any of those things. It's just the way I think about what I observe as what they're capable of today, and yet, where there's still some distinction, which is not intellectual capacity, it's just some behavioral thing that we still have that they don't.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it now. I want to. We got to stop. They're going to chunk us out. But if you want to ask Craig a question, all you got to do is buy a book from him over there.
Yep.
Okay, first I want to thank Town Hall. Once again, we've had a long-standing relationship with Town Hall, and it's great to see everybody that came out here. Second, I want to highlight my colleague, Sui Wong, is going to talk next Wednesday at 1, I think. It'll be webcast out of the ISB, isbscience.org, on a new ways to look at cancer. And third, because Craig was a board member at ISB for so long, we prepared, this is from the quaint old days when humans did science. And some of the top papers that came out during the time you were on our board for you. So thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you, that's great.